In July 1944, while World War II still raged across Europe and the Pacific, 730 delegates from 44 countries gathered at a luxury resort in the mountains of New Hampshire. For 3 weeks, they negotiated the future of the global financial system. The official story says they created a cooperative framework for international monetary stability, institutions to prevent another Great Depression, a system based on mutual benefit and shared prosperity. But that's not what happened. What happened at Bretton Woods was the greatest financial power grab in history. The United States, while most of the world was destroyed by war, imposed a monetary system that would make the dollar the center of global finance, transform America into an economic empire, and give it control over the financial destiny of every nation on Earth. The question isn't whether Bretton Woods created the modern financial system. The question is, why did 44 countries agree to give America that much power? Here, where history, power, and economics meet, we reveal the truths that shape civilizations. The Bretton Woods Agreement established 3 things. First, the dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Second, every other currency would be pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. Third, 2 new institutions would be created, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, to manage the system and provide loans to countries in crisis. It sounded reasonable. It sounded fair. It wasn't. It was the architecture of American financial hegemony, and it was designed that way from the beginning. Here's the paradox: in 1944, the United States held 70% of the world's monetary gold. Europe was in ruins. Asia was devastated. The British Empire, once the dominant financial power, was bankrupt from fighting the war. Only America had the industrial capacity, the economic strength, and the gold reserves to dictate terms, and dictate it did. Bretton Woods wasn't a negotiation. It was an imposition dressed up as cooperation, and the world with no alternatives accepted it. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to 1931. That's when Britain abandoned the gold standard. For centuries, the British pound had been the world's reserve currency, backed by gold, trusted globally. But the Great Depression destroyed that system. Countries began hoarding gold, banks failed, trade collapsed, Britain couldn't maintain the peg. In September 1931, it suspended gold convertibility. The pound crashed, international trade froze, currencies became weapons. Countries devalued competitively, trying to gain export advantages. It was economic warfare, and it made the Depression worse. The 1930s were chaos. Without a stable international monetary system, trade required complex barter arrangements. Countries formed currency blocks. The sterling bloc, the dollar bloc, the Reichsmark bloc, each competed against the others. Trust disappeared, credit dried up, and economic nationalism fueled political extremism. Many historians argue that the monetary chaos of the 1930s directly contributed to the rise of fascism and the outbreak of World War II. Without stable money, there's no stable politics. American policymakers understood this. As early as 1941, before the United States even entered the war, Treasury officials began planning the post-war monetary system. They knew Europe would be destroyed. They knew Britain would be bankrupt. They knew America would emerge as the only economic superpower, and they designed a system to lock in that advantage permanently. The chief architect was Dexter White, a senior Treasury official. His plan was simple: make the dollar the world's reserve currency, make gold the ultimate anchor, and make America the gatekeeper of both. Britain, meanwhile, had its own plan. John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist of the era, proposed an international currency called the banker, managed by a global central bank. No single country would dominate. It would be truly multilateral, fair, balanced. The Americans rejected it immediately. Why would they accept a system that didn't privilege the dollar? They had the power, they had the gold, they had the leverage, and they used it. When the delegates arrived at Bretton Woods in July 1944, the outcome was already decided. The Americans had written the framework. The British, desperate for American loans to finance the war, had no choice but to accept. Keynes fought for concessions. He argued for flexibility, for safeguards against American dominance, for protections for debtor nations. He lost every major battle. The final agreement was essentially the American plan with minor modifications. Britain, the former financial hegemon, was forced to accept subordination to American monetary power. It was humiliating, but Britain was broke. It had no leverage. Here's how the system worked. The dollar was fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. The U.S. government promised to exchange dollars for gold at that rate for foreign central banks. Every other currency was then pegged to the dollar at a fixed rate. If you wanted French francs, you'd trade dollars at a fixed ratio. If you wanted Japanese yen, same thing. The dollar became the intermediary for all international transactions. If Brazil wanted to buy machinery from Germany, it had to acquire dollars first. The The world economy ran on dollars, and only America could print them. This gave the United States extraordinary power. It could run trade deficits without consequence because other countries needed dollars for international trade. It could print money to finance wars, welfare programs, or anything else and export the inflation to the rest of the world. Other countries had to maintain dollar reserves, which meant buying U.S. Treasury bonds. Essentially, the world financed American government spending. It was a brilliant scam, and it was built into the treaty. But the real control mechanism was the International Monetary Fund. The IMF was sold as a cooperative institution to provide short-term loans to countries facing balance of payments crises, but it was structured to ensure American dominance. Voting power was based on financial contributions. The U.S., as the largest contributor, had veto power over major decisions. The IMF headquarters was in Washington. The World Bank president was always American. The system was designed to look multilateral while functioning as an instrument of American policy, and here's how it worked in practice. If a country faced a financial crisis, it could borrow from the IMF, but the loan came with conditions called structural adjustment programs. The country had to cut government spending, privatize state assets, deregulate industries, open markets to foreign investment, and orient its economy toward exports. These policies benefited American corporations and banks. They opened developing countries to exploitation, and they were enforced through debt. If you didn't comply, the loans stopped. Your currency collapsed. Your economy imploded. This pattern played out repeatedly. In the 1950s and 60s, dozens of newly independent countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America needed development capital. They borrowed from the World Bank and IMF. The loans came with conditions that locked them into exporting raw materials and importing American manufactured goods. They were never allowed to develop independent industrial capacity. The debt kept them dependent, and when they couldn't pay, the IMF imposed austerity, cut social spending, slash wages, sell public assets to foreign corporations. It was neocolonialism through finance. Britain experienced this firsthand. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, Britain and France invaded Egypt to seize control of the Suez Canal. The United States opposed the invasion, and it used financial power to force a retreat. The U.S. threatened to dump British pounds and refuse IMF support, which would have crashed the British economy. Britain, despite being a supposed ally and co-creator of the Bretton Woods system, had no choice but to comply. It withdrew from Suez. The humiliation was complete. The British Empire effectively ended that day. America was the new hegemon, and Bretton Woods was the mechanism, but the system had a fatal flaw. The U.S. had promised to exchange dollars for gold at $35 per ounce. But as the U.S. printed more dollars to finance the Vietnam War, the Great Society, and global military expansion, there weren't enough gold reserves to back them. By the late 1960s, foreign central banks held more dollars than the U.S. had gold. France, led by Charles de Gaulle, began demanding gold for dollars. They called America's bluff. In 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window. He unilaterally ended dollar-gold convertibility. Bretton Woods collapsed. But here's the remarkable thing: American financial dominance didn't end. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency. Why? Because there was no alternative. The global economy was so intertwined with the dollar that switching was impossible. Oil was priced in dollars. International debt was denominated in dollars. Central bank reserves were held in dollars. The system had become self-reinforcing. Even without gold backing, the dollar dominated. The U.S. had successfully transitioned from a gold-backed empire to a pure fiat currency empire. And it happened because Bretton Woods had built the infrastructure. The institutions created at Bretton Woods, the IMF and World Bank, continue to operate today. They still impose structural adjustment. They still enforce austerity. They still serve American interests. When Argentina defaulted in 2001, the IMF forced privatization and deregulation. When Greece faced a debt crisis in 2010, the IMF demanded pension cuts and wage reductions. When countries in Africa and Asia need development loans, the World Bank requires market liberalization. The pattern hasn't changed. The system created in 1944 is still functioning, and it still transfers wealth from the global south to the global north. Here's the truth they don't want you to understand: Bretton Woods wasn't about preventing another depression. It was about ensuring American economic dominance in the post-war world. It was about replacing the British Empire with an American one, and it worked. The U.S. emerged from World War II as the only major economy intact. It had 70% of the world's gold. It had the world's reserve currency. It had institutions designed to enforce its will, and it used all of that to build an empire not through colonies but through debt, currency, and control of international financial institutions. The brilliance of Bretton Woods was that it made domination look like cooperation. Countries weren't conquered, they were offered loans, they weren't colonized, they were given development assistance. But the conditions of those loans and that assistance ensured dependence. And dependence is control. The empire the United States built after 1944 was more subtle than the British Empire, but it was no less powerful, and in some ways it was more insidious because it was harder to see. What sustains this system isn't military power, though that helps. It's the dollar's role as reserve currency. Every country needs dollars for trade. Every country holds treasury bonds as reserves. Every country is tied to American monetary policy. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it causes crises in developing countries. When the U.S. runs deficits, it exports inflation globally. And there's nothing other countries can do about it because the alternative is exclusion from the global financial system. The U.S. doesn't need to invade. It just needs to control the money. This is why challenges to the dollar are met with such hostility. When Saddam Hussein announced in 2000 that Iraq would sell oil in euros instead of dollars, it was a direct threat to American financial hegemony. When Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency to replace the dollar in African trade, it threatened the system. Both leaders were removed. Whether that's causation or correlation, the pattern is clear: threats to dollar dominance are not tolerated. And now we're seeing the system strain again. China is challenging American dominance. It's created alternative institutions, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank. It's promoting the yuan as an alternative reserve currency. It's building trade networks that bypass the dollar. Russia has been largely cut off from dollar-based finance due to sanctions. Countries are increasingly trading in local currencies. The BRICS nations are exploring alternatives to SWIFT, the dollar-based international payment system. Bretton Woods is dying, but what comes next? The danger is that the transition won't be peaceful. The U.S. has built its entire geopolitical strategy on financial dominance. Losing that dominance means losing global influence. And empires don't surrender power voluntarily. The risk is that economic competition becomes military conflict. That currency wars become real wars. History suggests this is likely. Every transition from one hegemon to another has involved violence. The question is whether this time will be different. Here's what Bretton Woods really created: a world where money is power, where debt is control, where institutions disguised as international cooperation are actually tools of domination. It created a system where the rules favor those who write them, where crises are opportunities for exploitation, where sovereignty is conditional on financial compliance. And it did all of this under the banner of stability, cooperation, and shared prosperity. The delegates who gathered in New Hampshire in 1944 believed they were preventing another Great Depression. They believed they were creating a fairer world. But what they actually created was a mechanism for the most powerful country to extract wealth from everyone else. And that mechanism is still operating. The IMF is still imposing austerity. The World Bank is still financing projects that benefit corporations over people. The dollar is still the world's reserve currency. And the US is still using financial power to enforce its will globally. If this gave you a new perspective on how power and money really work, subscribe. History has the answers, it'll show you where to look.